Alex here with a high conflict child custody video on high conflict child custody and abuse. I did a video some time ago called Alienation and Abuse. If I remember correctly, it ended up getting lumped into a new general video on parental alienation where I took like 4 or 5 different alienation videos and blobbed them all together. And in that video, I explained that alienation is really just a manifestation of underlying abuse, and I explained why. I won't go into it again since I have a different video dedicated to that topic. So this video is going to be similar, you could say analogous, only instead of alienation, we're talking about high conflict child custody. And not all conflict is to the degree that it becomes obsessive, never ending. I talk about that in the video, 3 levels of conflict. If you get a chance, definitely take a look at that video, because I think a lot of the people that don't agree with this video will say, well, hold on, in my situation, and I cover sort of the evolution of conflict in that video, specifically levels 1 and 2. Level 1 being that the conflict is while the relationship is ongoing, and as soon as the couple splits up, it naturally starts to decrease immediately. Level 2 being very similar to level 1. The only difference is that one or both of the parties to the relationship want their day in court, which usually manifests itself in the form of fighting hard for a trial or maybe an evidentiary hearing after an initial stipulation that went sour. And then once they have that trial or evidentiary hearing, they have gotten what they wanted from the justice system, the legal system, and they move on. Same as a level 1, only there is this urge for at least one fight with at least one neutral decision. The 3rd level is really what this video is focusing on, which is the problem of somebody having a personality that's obsessed with the conflict to the point of it being part of their identity or their entire identity. And that's what I talk about with the levels of conflict, and why some people are in these cases that never end. And that's because it's not really about getting a resolution, it's about continuing to exist for the high conflict parent. If the conflict ends, they end. They don't see any future where they're not fighting for their child. And in this video, I'm going to sort of do, I guess you could call it an extension. It's more me trying to explain why, and I've talked to other people about this before, why this extreme level of conflict always involves abuse, because it always does. And that has to do with the fact that the high conflict parent can't let the conflict end. So what happens, and this is what happened in my case, if you watch the My Docket series, you'll see the 8-year-long litigation, you'll see the filings, and you'll see the hearing videos, and you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see multiple different examples of it. What happens in this situation where a person's identity is attached to the conflict is that the targeted parent, once they stop reacting and they start to realize that they themselves don't really care for it anymore, they want to move on. I mean, there's this desire to protect your child, of course, but you also have a desire to move on in life. And people usually don't think of themselves as having a never-ending court fight as part of their identity. Most people want to better themselves, get a job, get a career, go to school. They have all these ordinary desires, and the high conflict parent doesn't. The high conflict parent's whole purpose is to fight. And so what starts to happen is the targeted parent just gets tired of it. And it goes to the point of even accepting unfair arrangements, so long as those unfair arrangements are good for the child. That's really the point at which this is going to all start to make sense to people. You have a lot of times, especially when you're younger, like me, you have situations where you want to fight because you maybe feel like you haven't been treated fairly in the relationship. You maybe have a history of yourself as a child who didn't have a parent, one of the parents in their lives, and you want to make sure that your child doesn't have that problem. And so a big part of that is fairness and equality. And fighting inequality and unfairness usually revolves around a deprivation of timeshare, deprivation of visitation, And in my case, not only that, but also the exclusion of access to your child's medical care. And that part eventually, the courts deal with that somewhat well, at least in Nevada. But eventually, the targeted parent just stops caring about that. It's after a few years, it's like, you know what, this isn't fair. The system sucks. The family court is dysfunctional. I really just don't care anymore about having equality. I just want to make sure that the best decisions are made for our child. Once that starts to happen, if the other parent isn't a conflict obsessed parent, usually the conflict ends. For whatever reason, they want more time at the house. They want to do all these decisions with medical, etc. The other parent backs off, and they kind of just accept that they have more power and they feel content with that, and it's over. These cases are not high conflict child custody cases. But in a high conflict child custody case, that parent can't allow that to happen, because if they accept and agree, there's nothing left to fight about. So what ends up happening is they have to move from the realm of just treating you unfairly into abusing your child. And there's so many examples in my case where this happened, but I think the best, most obvious example to people revolves around the dental care issues. When our son needed 7 extractions at age, 6 or 7, and she took active, not passive, active steps to interfere with the treatment. That is, I think, the most obvious example of a high conflict parent. Because if you're dealing with somebody who is neglectful or a drug addict or an alcoholic or something, you're dealing with somebody who just doesn't care. So they're not making decisions to ruin the child's life. They're just not being a parent in a way that could ruin a child's life. But when you have a passive parent, it leaves slack for the other parent to pick up. Also, an unfair situation in the other direction. Instead of a person not sharing the burdens of visitation and raising the child and going to the appointments, you have a person who really just wants to walk away from it. In which case, the non-conflict parent is like, okay, well, that's fine. It sucks. It's not fair, but whatever. At least I can take care of my son, my daughter. I can just take them to all the appointments and make all the decisions. It never ends up in court. This stuff is really common. Not with a high conflict ex. A high conflict ex is not passive. It's not that they're not making decisions. You're not dealing with inaction. You're dealing with the exact opposite. You're dealing with a situation where the conflict has ended and they're starving. So in my case, my ex decided this is what I have to do to keep the conflict going. He has identified that our son has serious dental damage and that he needs to get treatment or he could have an infection. And if I interfere with this, he will fight me. Most people, this blows their mind. It's inconceivable to most people that a mother would do this. And it's just because they don't understand high conflict child custody and they don't understand mental health issues, abnormal psychology. I have videos on this where I talk about evaluating mental health and stuff like that, so I'm not going to go into it now. But this is one of the problems, is that this just sounds so ludicrous that people won't accept it. And the only way you can really expose it is through a person's actions. Their words will always be deceptive because they're going to say what sounds true. If you pay attention to their actions, you'll be able to expose the contradictions in what they're doing. And that's what I had to do in my case, and that's what my attorney at the time did. You can actually watch the evidentiary hearing for yourself. There were so many other examples of this occurring, but the best example that really underlines the damage that a high conflict parent is willing to inflict on their child, in my case, was the dental neglect. Because it wasn't just 1 or 2, it was 3 or 4 very deliberate actions that she took to interfere with the treatment. To the point of not only she initially agreed to pay, and then when I paid my half, I think she just was hoping that I wouldn't pay my half. Then she reneged and said she wouldn't pay. And then rather than me saying, okay, well, we can't get the treatment, I just went ahead and paid her half. And so then what she did is, I agreed to pay, I didn't pay. He still went ahead and paid my half. I have to find another way to interfere with this. So she actually walked into the surgery area to interfere with the first treatment, with the first appointment. And then the second time, she interfered with the doctor having to do the pre-op. Multiple different examples of a person very actively involved in the sabotage and destruction of a child. And that's the, if you watch the case from the beginning all the way to that point and beyond, because the high conflict continues after that, you'll see that this is a situation that it does exist in the world. And I think a lot of my viewers have probably seen this, where they start to cave. People start to say, you know, just stop fighting about that. It's really about your kid. Just stop fighting. And they do stop fighting. And the agreements do start to come, even though they're unfair. But then the high conflict parent needs to find a new way to continue the conflict. And once you're being reasonable to the point of even accepting unfair arrangements, they have to move into the realm of abusing the child. They have no choice, because once they start to abuse the child, you will have to fight. The fight will continue. So that's really why high conflict child custody cases that go beyond level 3, again, please watch that video if you haven't seen it yet, inevitably are abusive situations, very active abusive situations that, in my opinion, this, as terrible as this sounds, in my opinion, has to lead to a termination of parental rights. Because when you're dealing with situations of parents who just are not able to be a parent, but won't actively sabotage their own child, you can deal with that by curtailing visitation rights, in extreme situations by allowing only phone and video contact. But when you're dealing with a person who, it's not that they're unwilling to stop abusing the child, but that they're incapable and that they're taking very active steps, it's a very dangerous situation. I think it's oftentimes judges just, especially new judges, just can't understand why somebody would do something like that, especially a mother. And because they can't understand it, they refuse to believe that it exists. And that's why I think some people are in these situations where they're quite literally watching their own child be emotionally and psychologically tortured. And there's nothing they can do because the court doesn't understand it. The best way, in my opinion, to prove this situation is by proving what I did in my case, the very active steps that the high conflict parent is taking to ruin their own child's life. I mean, a lot of this ties into, as I mentioned before, mental health. And I think that's another concern that some judges and people have, is if somebody has mental health issues, it's not their fault. But if you move in that direction, you just end up moving into the direction of what I talk about in the video, best interest of the parent, where you're putting what a parent deserves over what's best for the child. So, I mean, if best interest of the child sometimes results in situations that just aren't fair for parents. There may be a parent who just, for whatever reason, is doing the best that they can, but they just are for whatever reason, ruining their child's life, whether it's active or passive. And the court, of course, has to step in and sometimes make decisions that aren't fair to the parent, because that's what the best interest of the child requires. I talk about why so many judges and lawyers end up sucked into the problem of best interest of the parent in that video. So if you haven't seen the video, best interest of the parent, please take a look at it, because in many situations, the parent is the litigator. And for that reason, it's the judges end up moving from what's best for the child to how do we stop the litigation. And usually, in a judge's mind, stopping the litigation entails appeasing or placating an abusive parent, rather than doing what's best for the child and making the decision that's best for the child, because they're concerned that if they do that, the litigation will continue forever. And that's just more work for them. I think this is mainly a subconscious problem judges have. I don't think it's like judges wake up in the morning and think to themselves, which abusers am I going to give the child to, just so they stop filing paperwork. And I talk about this in the video, High Conflict Incompetence, which mainly deals with the problem of judges who just don't know what they're doing, which in Nevada is becoming less and less of a problem. Over time, I'm noticing that they're getting better about this. Now, the problem that I observe in my state is the problem of influence, is attorneys having so much influence that they're able to facilitate child abuse and neglect just because they have a better relationship with the court, especially if the other parent is representing themselves. But this is, I would call, a slow evolution in the correct direction. Ultimately, that is going to be resolved, hopefully, by gaining access to these proceedings to bring the public into them. So I think that's all I have. It's a really tragic situation from the sense of ignorance from both the bench and attorneys, more so than reality. Because, I mean, once I think judges and attorneys start to figure this out and make these tough decisions, I do think that these cases will resolve in the way that they should. But we're just not there yet. And the point of this video is to explain to people that high conflict child custody to the point of obsession, where the high conflict ex feels that this is their identity, inevitably will lead to abuse, and really severe abuse. I wouldn't be surprised if this is the type of mental and psychological damage that children suffer that leads them into crime and or, well, I was going to say and or crime, varying degrees of crime. So I think that this is probably all that I have for you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to post them down in the comments below. But all that being said, I will see you guys next time.